The day started like any other. I was brewing my morning coffee, a habit I couldn't break, when a loud, gut-wrenching scrape of metal on concrete shattered the calm. It was followed by a car horn so ear-piercing it made my dog, Max, yelp and bolt under the table. My heart raced as I rushed to the door, already bracing for the worst. And there she was, Karen Whitmore, her SUV half-wedged onto my front lawn, the front bumper dangerously close to my flower bed. She stood outside, arms crossed, her face twisted in an expression of utter outrage, as though I had personally offended her family. "What the hell is this?" she screeched, pointing at the low wooden fence I had installed just the day before. "You've blocked my shortcut. I've been using this driveway for months. Do you have any idea how much time I waste taking the long way around?" I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. My driveway, my property, and she was yelling at me like I'd vandalized her car instead of the other way around. My fists clenched as I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Karen," I said slowly, "this is my driveway, not a public road. You have no right to drive through here." She scoffed, waving her hand dismissively like I was an insect. "That's ridiculous. The HOA allows it. Everyone knows this is the fastest way out of the neighborhood. Why are you being so difficult?" I resisted the urge to laugh in sheer disbelief. "The HOA doesn't own my property, Karen. I do. And I'm sick of you treating my driveway like your personal shortcut." Her eyes darkened, and she leaned in, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. "Listen, sweetheart, I don't care what little rules you think apply here. I've been living in this neighborhood for 15 years. You're just the newbie trying to change things, but it won't work. This driveway has always been the shortcut, and it always will be." I clenched my fists. This woman was unreal. I had been dealing with her nonsense for months, seeing her car speed through my property, tearing up my gravel path without a second thought. And every time I tried to stop her, she ignored it. I put up cones. She moved them. I installed a small gate. She knocked it over. I even sent footage of her blatant trespassing to the HOA. But they shrugged it off, offering weak excuses. "Karen's been here forever. We can't just change things now." And now she was back again, acting like she had every right to be, furious with me for putting an end to her free ride. "I'm calling the HOA, Karen snapped, pulling out her phone. "They'll deal with this." I couldn't help but smirk. "Go ahead, Karen. Let's see how that works out for you." Her eyes narrowed, and she stomped back to her SUV. Struggling to reverse out of my lawn, she left deep, muddy tire marks. As I watched her speed off, my blood boiled. My hands were trembling with frustration. This wasn't just a fight over a driveway anymore. This was war. The afternoon dragged on with the usual tension in the air. I was still seething from the earlier confrontation when my phone buzzed. It was an email from the HOA. I sighed, bracing myself for what was surely another attack from Karen. Sure enough, when I opened it, my blood ran cold. The HOA wasn't coming after Karen. No, they were coming after me. "Dear homeowner, we have received multiple complaints regarding unauthorized modifications to community access pathways. The recent installation of a fence on your property has been deemed disruptive to neighborhood traffic patterns. We kindly ask that you remove it immediately to maintain community harmony. Sincerely, HOA." I stared at the screen, my anger flaring up again. Unauthorized modifications? Community harmony? This was a direct hit. Karen had gone straight to the HOA with her complaints, and now they were siding with her, as usual. How could they be so blind to the reality? My fence was keeping her from illegally using my driveway as a shortcut, and yet here they were, playing her game. I didn't hesitate. My hands trembled as I grabbed my coat and stormed out the door. I was heading to the HOA office to give them a piece of my mind. But the moment I walked in, I was met with the sight of Karen sitting smugly in the corner, chatting with board members like they were all old friends. Her victorious smirk sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Ah, Mr. Walker," the HOA president, Richard Turner said, barely glancing up from his papers. "We were just discussing your recent landscaping alterations." I crossed my arms, my patience thin. You mean the fence I built to keep Karen from trespassing on my property? A few awkward coughs and nervous glances passed between the board members before one of them spoke up. It's just that Karen's been using that path for years. It's sort of a neighborhood tradition. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Let me get this straight, I snapped. My property is apparently up for grabs because of some tradition? She's trespassing and you're siding with her? Karen gave a fake little laugh. Come on, Ethan. It's just a shortcut. You're overreacting. I clenched my fists, trying to stay composed. No, Karen. You've been abusing my property for far too long. And now, I'm done. Richard cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Technically, Karen does have a history with the community. I wasn't listening anymore. No, Richard. She has no right to drive through my driveway. And I'm not taking this anymore. I could hardly believe what I was hearing as I stood in the HOA office. Richard Turner, the HOA president, barely looked up from his papers as Karen sat across from him, smug as ever. My stomach churned as I tried to keep my cool. I had expected a fight, but nothing could have prepared me for how far Karen was willing to push this. The entire HOA board smirk. She was enjoying this too much. So, Mr. Walker, Richard finally said, glancing up with his usual formal demeanor, we've been discussing your recent modifications to the community access pathways. He barely seemed to notice the tension in the room as he continued. Your fence has become a point of concern. I leaned forward, my voice tight with frustration. You mean the fence I built to stop Karen from trespassing on my property? A few uneasy coughs rippled through the room as the board members exchanged glances. One of them cleared his throat. It's just that, well, Karen has been using that shortcut for years. It's kind of a tradition around here. I could feel my pulse quicken, my grip tightening on the chair's armrests. So let me get this straight, I shot back, my voice low, almost a growl. My property is up for grabs because of some so-called tradition? She's been trespassing for months, and now you're siding with her? Karen's face lit up with that insufferable smirk. It's not a big deal, Ethan. You're overreacting. It's just a little shortcut, after all. I couldn't hold back the rush of anger that boiled inside me. You've been abusing my property for long enough. Karen, this isn't about a shortcut anymore. This is about respect. And you've lost mine. The room fell quiet as Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He cleared his throat. Technically, Karen does have some history with the neighborhood. I didn't let him finish. I don't care about Karen's history. She has no right to be here. And I'm done letting her treat my home like a parking lot. I turned my gaze back to Karen, watching her jaw tighten as I felt the frustration and tension build inside me. Every attempt I made to stop her had been ignored or dismissed. The HOA, my neighbors, even the law, all too afraid to stand up to her. But this time, it was different. I wasn't going to back down. Later that afternoon, just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, my phone buzzed with another email. It was from the HOA, but this time the tone was different. It was personal. The words on the screen made my stomach churn. Dear homeowner, we have received complaints regarding unauthorized modifications to community access pathways. The recent fence installation on your property has been deemed disruptive to neighborhood traffic patterns. We kindly ask that you remove it immediately to maintain community harmony. Sincerely, HOA. I couldn't believe it. The HOA wasn't coming after Karen, but after me. This was the same organization that had turned a blind eye to her trespassing for months, and now they were siding with her. I stood there, staring at the email, my frustration mounting with every word. The fence that had been my last line of defense, my attempt to reclaim my space, was now under attack. I had enough. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my coat and stormed out the door, my blood boiling. I was heading straight to the HOA office. The minute I walked in, I saw Karen sitting smugly in the corner, chatting with the board members. Her smile could have been carved from stone, her self-assurance thick in the air. It was like she had already won. Mr. Walker, Richard Turner, the HOA president said, barely lifting his head from his papers. We've been discussing your recent landscaping alterations. I leaned in, fury bubbling under the surface. You mean the fence I installed to stop Karen from trespassing on my property? There was an awkward silence. A few coughs, a few glances exchanged between the board members. Then one spoke up. It's just that Karen's been using that path for years. It's sort of a neighborhood tradition. I shook my head, my jaw tightening. So now my property is a public space because of some tradition? She's trespassing and you're all complicit. Karen let out a fake laugh, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, come on, Ethan, it's just a shortcut. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. The nerve. I could feel my anger rising, but I refused to let it consume me. You've been abusing my property for far too long, Karen. This ends now. The HOA may be on your side, but I'm done playing by your rules. The room fell silent as Richard nervously shuffled through his papers. Technically, Karen does have some history in this neighborhood. I wasn't having it. You're telling me that history gives her the right to invade my private space? Not anymore. The next morning, I woke up to a new wave of frustration. I thought I'd seen the worst of it when Karen tried to intimidate me. But now the HOA had officially joined the fight. The email I received from them wasn't just a complaint. It was a direct assault on my decision to protect my property. The recent installation of your fence, it read, has been deemed disruptive to neighborhood traffic patterns. They demanded it be removed, calling it a violation of the neighborhood's so-called community harmony. I couldn't believe it. After months of Karen's repeated trespassing, and now this? The HOA, once again, was siding with her. I slammed my phone down in disbelief, feeling the anger surge through me. This wasn't just a battle over a driveway. It was a fight for my rights. I wasn't going to let this slide. I grabbed my jacket and stormed out the door, ready to make a stand. As I arrived at the HOA office, the familiar tension hit me like a wave. Inside, Karen sat smugly, chatting with Richard Turner and the board members, her face twisted in a grin of victory. It was as if she already knew how this would play out. "Mr. Walker," Richard said, barely looking up from his papers. "We've been discussing your recent landscaping alterations." I clenched my jaw and leaned in. "You mean the fence I installed to stop Karen from using my driveway as a shortcut?" There was an awkward pause before one of the board members spoke up. "It's just that, well, Karen's been using that path for years. It's a sort of neighborhood tradition." I felt my temper flare. Let me get this straight. Because of some tradition, my property is now public? Karen has no right to drive through my driveway. This has gone on long enough. Karen let out a laugh, pretending to be amused. "It's just a shortcut, Ethan. You're overreacting." I shook my head, my frustration boiling over. "No, Karen. You've been abusing my property for too long, and I'm done letting you treat it like your personal road." Richard's expression shifted. He was clearly uncomfortable, but he tried to keep his composure. "Technically, Karen does have some history with the neighborhood." I cut him off. "That doesn't matter. She has no right to use my driveway, and I'm done tolerating this nonsense." That evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset in quiet contemplation. My thoughts were still tangled with the events of the day, and though I felt the tension building, I knew that my plan wasn't over yet. I had made it clear to Karen and the HOA that I wasn't going to back down. The fence was staying, and so was my newfound sense of control. The idea of letting her use my property as a shortcut for any longer made my blood boil. But the war wasn't won yet. I looked out at the maze of bushes and hedges. I had been planning for days. My secret weapon. After everything she had done, I was ready to fight back in the only way. I knew how. By making her feel what it was like to be trapped. Trapped by her own stubbornness. Trapped by her entitled sense of ownership over something that wasn't hers. The maze was my answer, and it was going to be perfect. The next morning, my landscaper, Alex Monroe, arrived with his team. The work was intensive, but the maze had to be meticulously designed. I wanted every path to be confusing, every corner to turn into a dead end. I didn't want to just keep Karen out. I wanted her to experience the frustration of knowing she could never take A shortcut again. Alex was just as invested in the plan as I was. He chuckled when I explained my vision, but I could see the excitement in his eyes. "It's the pettiest thing I've ever heard," Alex said, smiling. "But I love it. Let's do it." As the days passed, I watched as the maze began to take shape. The hedges grew thick and dense, a perfect barrier. It wasn't just a fence, it was a labyrinth. I pictured Karen trying to drive through, only to realize too late that she had walked straight into my trap. The thought made me smile, but I stayed patient. The time would come soon enough. Then it happened. One morning, I saw Karen's SUV slowly rolling up to my driveway, just like she always did. But this time, as she got closer, she saw the hedge maze and hesitated. She pulled in, no longer confident that the path was clear. My pulse quickened as I watched from my window, waiting for her next move. The sound of her tires crunching against gravel echoed in the air. She hesitated again, then reversed, trying to navigate. But the paths were deliberately twisted. She backed up again and again, each time finding herself at yet another dead end. I couldn't help but chuckle to myself, watching her frustration mount. The tension was unbearable as Karen sat in her car, trapped in the middle of my hedge maze. I watched from the safety of my porch, my eyes locked on her every move. She was attempting to back out, but each time she reversed, she found herself at another dead end. Her frustration was becoming palpable. The constant honking of her horn echoed through the neighborhood, a sound filled with anger and desperation. But there was no way out. I knew it was only a matter of time before she would get out of the car and try to walk through the maze. It was designed to be disorienting, frustrating, and almost impossible to navigate without some serious effort. I had taken great care in ensuring that the maze would be both an obstacle and a symbol of resistance to her constant violations. Karen had no idea what she was about to face. Then, just as I expected, I saw her slam the door and storm out of the SUV. Her face was flushed with rage as she started, walking through the maze, her steps quick and angry. But every turn she made only led her back to the same spot, like a rat caught in a cage. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her try to retrace her steps, realizing just how much of a fool she had become. It was beautiful in its simplicity. She was trapped in the very maze that she had forced me to create. The thought that she had tried for so long to bully her way into using my property, and now she was the one paying the price, filled me with satisfaction. But I knew it wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to give up so easily. As she stumbled around, her frustration growing, I could see her reaching for her phone, no doubt planning to call the HOA or the police. But there was nothing they could do. This was my property. She had entered willingly, and now she was paying the consequences. She let out a frustrated scream, the sound piercing the air. Minutes later, she finally found her way out, panting and sweating. Her face was a mixture of anger and humiliation. She walked toward her car, but before she could drive off, I stepped outside, casually leaning against the porch railing. I waited for her to make her move. "Lost in my maze, Karen?" I called out, my voice laced with satisfaction. She turned to glare at me, her eyes burning with fury. "This is harassment," she hissed. I raised an eyebrow. "Harassment? You're the one who trespassed onto my property." Her eyes widened with disbelief. She was defeated, and she knew it. After what felt like an eternity, the moment of triumph finally arrived. Karen, looking completely defeated, walked past me as I stood at the front of my house. The police had already come and gone, leaving behind a feeling of sweet justice. Her attempts to fight back had failed miserably, and now I could see her, the once powerful HOA bully, defeated, walking away with nothing but the weight of her loss. It was almost poetic. As I watched her retreat, the satisfaction was undeniable. The very same woman who had harassed me for months, thinking she could push me around, was now reduced to nothing more than a helpless figure, walking away with her tail between her legs. Her arrogance had finally caught up to her. I couldn't help but feel a surge of deep satisfaction, knowing that I had stood my ground and had won. Not just for myself, but for the entire neighborhood that had lived under her. oppressive reign for so long. The neighbors who had once quietly avoided the conflict were now watching from their windows. Their curiosity piqued. I could see their expressions, surprised, perhaps even relieved, that someone had finally stood up to Karen. Her reign of terror had come to an end, and I was the one who had brought it down. As Karen disappeared into the distance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. The truth was, this wasn't just about a driveway. It was about respect, about standing up for what was right, no matter how much power or influence the other person seemed to have. The weeks that followed were a blur. The HOA, now embarrassed and weakened by the failed attempts to support Karen, backed off. Karen, once so sure of her control, became a ghost in the neighborhood. She avoided eye contact, never once addressing me. As the days went by, I could feel the peace returning to my life. The weight of Karen's threats and manipulations had lifted, and with it came a sense of freedom I hadn't realized I was missing. But the most satisfying part? Watching Karen's once pristine image crumble. The community had seen her for what she truly was, a petty, self-centered tyrant, and that was the ultimate victory. She had lost everything, and I had come out on top. I had endured the battle, and now justice had been served. A few weeks passed since the arrest, and Karen was nowhere to be seen. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. The neighborhood had returned to a peaceful rhythm, and the tension I had carried for so long had finally begun to dissipate. However, a strange feeling lingered in the air, like the calm before the storm. It wasn't until one chilly evening that the unease resurfaced. I was sitting on my porch, savoring a rare moment of tranquility when I noticed movement by my driveway. There, standing in the shadows near the entrance to my maze, was Karen. I froze, my heart racing as I watched her cautiously approach. She was staring at the hedges with a mixture of fear and something else, maybe determination or desperation. I couldn't tell. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. After all, she had been silenced, humiliated, and banished from the HOA. But there she was, the woman who had made my life miserable for so long, standing before my property once again. The irony wasn't lost on me. After everything she had put me through, she was now standing at the very place where her power had ended. I stood up, my gaze never leaving her. She didn't notice me at first, her eyes fixed on the entrance of the maze, as if she was contemplating whether or not to venture inside. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her body tense. I couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened, she was still trying to reclaim what she had lost. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Finally, she took a step forward. Then another. She was walking into the maze. But this time, it wasn't because she was trespassing, it was because she was choosing to. It was as if she was accepting her defeat and trying to prove to herself that she still had control. I stepped off my porch, walking slowly toward her. Karen hadn't noticed yet, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. It was as if the entire neighborhood had paused to watch. I was about to witness something I never thought I would. Karen, the woman who had terrorized me, lost and frustrated in her own creation. This was the moment she would finally understand the consequences of her actions. Her footsteps faltered, her face twisted with frustration as she realized what she had gotten herself into. I couldn't help but smile. Finally, she was trapped in the maze that had once been a symbol of my victory. A week after the HOA's defeat, the quiet in the neighborhood felt almost surreal. It was as though the air had cleared, and the weight of constant tension had lifted. But I knew better. People like Karen, who believed they could rule their world with entitlement, didn't go down without a fight. And I could feel it. She wasn't done yet. It wasn't long before I received an email from the HOA. This time, it was more than just a vague complaint. The message was direct, and its tone was one of finality. We regret to inform you that the HOA has formally decided that your hedge maze must be removed within the next week. Failure to comply will result in legal action, including fines. The email sent a wave of frustration through me. How could they side with her again? I had already been through this battle. Yet, here it was, Another attempt to push me down. I thought about just ignoring it, but I wasn't about to let Karen or the HOA think they could push me around. After everything that had happened, I was ready to finish this once and for all. The HOA wasn't going to be my problem anymore. I walked over to my mailbox the next morning, bracing myself. There it was, a letter from the HOA. I tore it open, and my eyes scanned the contents quickly. The letter was as expected, filled with more threats. But this time, something was different. The tone felt more personal. It was as if Karen herself had written the letter. Her presence was felt in every word. At first I felt my blood boiling. How dare they? But then I paused. I took a deep breath. I was done letting this disrupt my life. I wasn't going to back down. This wasn't about a maze or a driveway anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could control me. I responded immediately, my fingers flying over the keyboard. My words were firm and precise. The Hedge maze is my property, legally compliant, and it will remain as is. If the HOA wishes to pursue legal action, they may do so. But understand this: I will fight back, and I will win. I hit send, a sense of peace settling in. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was no longer afraid. I knew now that the true victory wasn't just in defending my property, but in standing up for my rights when no one else would. It was a few days after I sent my response to the HOA, and I thought the battle was finally over. But then, I got an unexpected knock on my door. When I opened it, there stood Richard Turner, the HOA president, along with Karen, her smug expression still intact. My heart dropped. I hadn't expected them to show up in person. "Mr. Walker," Richard said, his voice cold and formal, "we need to have a discussion about your landscaping choices." I could see Karen standing there beside him, arms crossed, an annoying smirk on her face. This wasn't just a discussion. This was another attempt to make me bend to their will. I took a deep breath, keeping my composure. Discussion? Or another attempt to force me to remove my hedge maze? Richard shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Karen, who seemed to enjoy the power she thought she still held. "The HOA has voted," Richard continued, "and your hedge maze is considered an unauthorized obstruction. We are formally demanding its removal." I stared at him, my anger rising. Unauthorized obstruction? My property, my rules. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were still siding with Karen, who had terrorized the neighborhood for so long. Karen piped up, trying to sound sympathetic. "This isn't just about you, Ethan. The neighborhood is upset. You're making it difficult for people to get through." Her voice dripped with false concern. I shook my head. "The only person upset is you, Karen. And your neighborhood concern is nothing more than a selfish excuse to keep using my property as your personal shortcut." Karen's face twisted with frustration as Richard fumbled through his papers, trying to back up their request. "You're creating a hazard," Karen continued. "People need that shortcut. This is unreasonable." I let out a deep sigh, trying to keep calm. "No, Karen. What's unreasonable is the fact that you think you can control what happens on my property. This maze stays." Richard looked at Karen, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Well, technically, your property isn't owned by the HOA," I interrupted, seizing the moment. "Exactly. So, take your request and get out of my property. I'm not removing anything." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Karen's eyes burned with anger, but Richard was visibly trying to avoid further conflict. Without another word, they turned and walked away. But the sense of victory I felt wasn't complete. It was clear that this wasn't over yet, but I was ready. Karen had underestimated me, and the HOA was about to find out just how determined I was to keep my property safe from their interference. The days that followed were filled with a strange sense of quiet. Karen had been forced to retreat, but I could sense that it wasn't over. It was never really over when it came to someone like her. Still, I tried to go on with my life. The hedge maze remained intact, as a symbol of both my victory and my determination to not let anyone trample over my rights. The HOA seemed to have backed off, but their silence spoke volumes. Then, one evening, just when I thought the storm had passed, it all came crashing back. I was sipping coffee on my porch, enjoying the cool breeze. When I saw her, Karen, she was standing at the edge of my property, looking at the maze like she was studying it. Her posture was stiff, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. It was almost as if she was trying to figure out how to beat me at my own game. I stood up, my heart starting to race. I knew exactly what she was up to. Karen had never been the type to accept defeat. The fact that she had lost everything, her power, her control over the neighborhood, was something she couldn't just walk away from. I could see the fire in her eyes. She was plotting her next move. She had no idea how much I had already prepared for this. The maze wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a challenge, a test of patience, and now it was a game. Karen had already failed once, but now I knew it was time to make sure she understood that her manipulative tactics would no longer work. Without hesitation, I made my way over to the maze's entrance. Karen didn't see me coming. She was too focused, too obsessed with finding a way to beat me. When I finally reached the entrance, I stopped just behind her. "Karen!" I called out, my voice calm but firm. She spun around, her eyes filled with that familiar burning rage. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed, stepping forward as if she could intimidate me. I smiled, a sense of calm settling over me. "I don't think I've won, Karen," I replied. "I know I have." The shock on her face was priceless. The moment she realized that her threats, her manipulations, her bullying tactics had no place here, it was worth everything. "Let's see how far you're willing to go now," I added, my eyes never leaving hers. She stood there, unsure of how to proceed, her mind working overtime. But deep down, she knew it was over. The game was up. The tension had been building for weeks. After Karen's failed attempts to intimidate me and the HOA's disgraceful silence, I thought it was finally over. I should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to give up, not when she felt her control slipping away. And now, with her reputation tarnished, I knew she was plotting her next move. I was on my porch one afternoon, lost in my thoughts, when I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel. My heart skipped a beat as I looked up. There she was, Karen, driving her SUV slowly down the street, her eyes scanning the surroundings, her gaze eventually fixed on my house, narrowing with a cold intensity. She had come back. I immediately stood up, my pulse quickening. The last time we had crossed paths, she had been humiliated in front of the HOA, and her precious little kingdom had crumbled. But Karen was persistent, and she wasn't going to let this defeat slide. I watched her park near the edge of my property and step out of her car. Her body language was stiff, her posture rigid, with an unsettling mix of arrogance and desperation. She wasn't here just to talk, I could tell. This was personal. As she walked towards the hedge maze, I knew exactly what she was thinking. She had no idea what she was walking into. I had carefully designed the maze to be an obstacle for her, and now it was about to become her undoing. She thought she could intimidate me into submission, but she didn't understand. This was my territory now. With slow, deliberate steps, I approached her. I made my presence known just as she reached the entrance. She turned to face me, her eyes flashing with contempt. "Think you've won, Ethan?" she spat, her voice dripping with anger. I smiled calmly, stepping closer. "I don't think, Karen. I know I have." Her jaw clenched, and for a moment, I could see the wheels turning in her head. But she didn't back down. Instead, she took a step forward, trying to put on a brave face. "Your maze," she sneered, "won't stop me. I'm not afraid of a few bushes." I couldn't help but laugh. "You've underestimated me, Karen. Again." The moment of triumph was nearly in reach, and I could see the frustration building in her. She had thought she could control everything. But now it was clear she was in over her head. The game had changed, and this time she wasn't going to win. The day after Karen's attempt to sabotage my hedge maze, I woke up with a sense of calm, but also the knowledge that the battle wasn't quite over. Sure, the HOA had backed off for now, and Karen had been caught in her own trap, but her wrath was still simmering. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd try something even more desperate to get what she wanted. Then the doorbell rang. I wasn't surprised to see Karen standing on my doorstep again, this time with an air of determination in her eyes. The usual smugness had been replaced with frustration. She didn't say a word as I opened the door, her eyes locked on mine, seething with that familiar sense of entitlement. "You really think you've won, don't you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "I'm not going to let you get away with this. You've messed with the wrong person." I stood there, unmoved. "Karen," I began, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm not the one who's been messing with anyone. I'm just protecting my property from you." Her face twisted with rage, but I could see the moment she realized there was no way around this. The maze had been the final straw for her, and the more she tried to fight it, the more she lost. "Don't think this is over," she snapped, turning sharply on her heels and storming off the porch. For a moment, I felt an odd sense of satisfaction. Karen had finally hit her breaking point. It wasn't about the maze anymore. It was about the power struggle she had tried to maintain over everyone. And now she knew she had lost. Days passed without incident, and the neighborhood returned to its peaceful state. The HOA, now embarrassed by their blind support for Karen, had dissolved any further complaints. My hedge maze had become a landmark, drawing attention from curious neighbors and even families who enjoyed walking through it. It was a victory, my victory. Then, just when I thought everything had settled, I saw Karen again, but this time it was different. She was standing at the edge of the maze, staring at it. There was no anger in her eyes, no frustration, just resignation. She had finally accepted the inevitable. Her reign of control had ended. And as I watched her walk away, I felt a deep sense of peace. The war was over, for good.